Corcoran State Prison, located in California's Central Valley, has been cited repeatedly in court filings, federal investigations, and news reports as one of the most dangerous and controversial maximum security prisons in the United States. Known for its history of extreme violence, deadly use of force incidents, and housing some of the state's most dangerous inmates, Corcoran became a focal point in national debates over prison safety, inmate rights, and the limits of institutional control. This documentary examines how Corcoran earned its reputation, what life inside really looks like according to verified records, and why its legacy continues to shape the American prison system. The moment the gates close behind you, the outside world stops mattering. According to former correctional officials quoted in news reports, Corcoran State Prison was designed to do exactly that, to seal people off, not just physically, but psychologically. Built in the late 1980s and opened in 1988, Corcoran was meant to be a modern solution to California's exploding prison population. Instead, it will become a symbol of what happens when overcrowding, fear, and institutional power collide. Here is the contradiction that defines Corcoran. It was designed to be one of the safest prisons in the state, with reinforced concrete housing units, carefully controlled movement, and layered security protocols. Yet according to court records and investigative journalism, it became one of the deadliest. This is not rumor. This is documented history. Corcoran sits in Kings County, surrounded by flat farmland that stretches for miles. From the outside, it looks quiet, almost ordinary. Low buildings, fences, guard towers rising above the horizon. But former inmates and officers interviewed by journalists have said the calm is deceptive. Inside, tension never disappears. It only changes shape. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation records, Corcoran houses a large population of Level 4 inmates, the highest security classification in the state. These are individuals considered high risk due to violence, gang affiliation, or prior behavior in custody. Many have already failed in other prisons. Corcoran is where they end up when nothing else works. The first thing most new arrivals notice is the silence between sounds. Not quiet, never quiet, but gaps filled with anticipation. Metal doors slam shut, radios crackle, boots echo on concrete. Then nothing. According to testimony from former inmates cited in federal lawsuits, that silence is often more unnerving than the noise. It means something could happen at any moment. By the early 1990s, Corcoran was already under scrutiny. According to court filings later unsealed, a pattern of violent incidents began to emerge in one particular area, the prison's exercise yards. These yards were designed with controlled exposure in mind. Inmates were placed in separate cages within the yard, supposedly to prevent contact between rival gang members. The intention was safety. The result, according to multiple investigations, was catastrophic. Between 1989 and 1994, at least 8 inmates were killed and dozens wounded in what became known publicly as gladiator-style fights. According to federal indictments and Department of Justice investigations, some correctional officers allegedly staged situations where rival gang members were placed together in the yard, then shot when fights broke out. Officers later claimed self-defense, citing imminent threats. The state's version of events held for years. According to official incident reports at the time, officers acted to protect themselves and others. But families of the deceased, civil rights attorneys, and investigative journalists began asking uncomfortable questions. Why did these confrontations keep happening? Why were rival inmates repeatedly placed together? Why did shootings follow the same pattern? In 1995, a federal grand jury investigation changed everything. According to court documents, several correctional officers were indicted on charges related to civil rights violations. Testimony described a culture where violence was not just anticipated, but sometimes allowed to escalate. One former officer, speaking under oath according to transcripts later reported by major newspapers, described the yard as a place where everybody knew what was going to happen before it happened. The indictments sent shockwaves through California's prison system. Although not all charges resulted in convictions, the revelations alone permanently altered Corcoran's reputation. According to legal scholars, The case became one of the most significant examinations of use of force policies in modern American corrections. But violence at Corcoran was never limited to the yard. According to reports from the Office of the Inspector General and federal monitors, housing units themselves became pressure cookers. Cells designed for one inmate often held two or more during peak overcrowding years. This overcrowding strained staff, resources, and tempers. Conflicts that might have been contained elsewhere escalated quickly. Gang dynamics played a major role. According to court filings and law enforcement assessments, Corcoran housed members of multiple prison gangs with long histories of rivalry. These affiliations didn't disappear at intake. They defined daily life. Where you stood, where you walked, who you spoke to, even which direction you faced in common areas. Former inmates interviewed by journalists described learning these rules fast or suffering the consequences. According to those accounts, mistakes were rarely forgiven. A glance interpreted the wrong way could be enough to spark retaliation. And once violence started, it rarely stayed contained to one person. Correctional staff were not immune. According to union statements and internal reports cited in state audits, officers faced extreme stress, long hours, and constant risk. Assaults on staff were not uncommon. Burnout was widespread. Critics argue that this environment encouraged an us versus them mentality that made de-escalation harder, not easier. Medical care became another flashpoint. According to lawsuits filed in federal court, inmates at Corcoran alleged delays in treatment, inadequate mental health services, and insufficient emergency response. Some cases resulted in settlements. Others dragged on for years. Collectively, they painted a picture of a system operating beyond its limits. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Corcoran was frequently cited in broader lawsuits challenging California's entire prison system. According to federal court rulings, overcrowding across the state had reached unconstitutional levels. Corcoran, as a high-security facility, became a case study in what overcrowding looks like at its worst. Yet, even as reforms were discussed, daily life inside continued. Count, yard, lockdown, repeat. According to inmates' sworn declarations, days blurred together. Violence wasn't constant, but it was always possible. That uncertainty shaped everything. One former inmate, identified in court records under a pseudonym, described lying awake at night, listening to distant alarms, and trying to determine whether they were close or far away. Another described the moment before yard release as the most dangerous part of the day, when tension peaked and everyone watched everyone else. According to sociologists who later analyzed Corcoran in academic studies, the prison represented a paradox. Extreme control measures were supposed to prevent violence. In practice, they often concentrated it. When people feel trapped with no legitimate outlet, pressure builds. At Corcoran, that pressure sometimes exploded. The state responded with policy changes. Yard procedures were revised. Training was updated. Oversight increased. According to official reports, shootings declined after the mid-1990s. But the damage was done. Corcoran's name had become shorthand for institutional failure. Today, Corcoran State Prison still operates. It still houses some of California's most dangerous inmates. According to recent public records, it remains one of the most tightly controlled environments in the state. But its past is never far away. Former officers interviewed years later have described Corcoran as a place that changes you. Some left law enforcement entirely. Others carried the experience with them long after retirement. Former inmates have said the same. Even after release or transfer, Corcoran stayed with them. This is only the beginning of the story, because what happened at Corcoran did not stay at Corcoran. It influenced national conversations about prison oversight, use of force, and accountability. It forced courts, lawmakers, and the public to confront an uncomfortable reality. Maximum security does not always mean maximum safety. By the time an inmate reaches Corcoran State Prison, the journey has already stripped away any illusion of choice. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation records, Corcoran was designed to house inmates deemed incompatible with other facilities. Those labeled as management problems, validated gang members, or individuals whose presence destabilized lower security yards. It wasn't built for reform. It was built for control. The prison sits flat and exposed in California's Central Valley, surrounded by farmland and heat that seems to press down from the sky. In summer, temperatures routinely climb past 100 degrees. According to court filings and investigative reporting, the extreme heat has been a recurring issue inside the facility, compounding already harsh living conditions. There's no coastal fog here, no natural barrier, no dramatic cliffs. Corcoran is isolated by design, surrounded by open land that offers no escape and no distraction. The message is clear before anyone steps inside. This place exists to contain. The intake process at Corcoran is clinical and relentless. Former inmates interviewed by journalists have described it as disorienting rather than violent. You are searched. You are cataloged. You are assigned a number that will follow you through every door, every meal, every count. Personal property is reduced to what the institution allows. Everything else becomes evidence, contraband, or memory. For many arrivals, the first shock isn't fear, it's silence. Corcoran's architecture dampens sound. Thick concrete walls swallow echoes. Heavy steel doors close with a finality that doesn't ring out, it settles. According to public records, much of the prison's layout was engineered to minimize movement and visibility, a response to decades of violent incidents across California's prison system. Long corridors, segmented yards, and reinforced housing units ensure that inmates see only fragments of the institution at any given time. You don't experience Corcoran all at once. You experience it in pieces. Housing assignments at Corcoran are not random. According to CDCR classification protocols referenced in court documents, inmates are sorted by a combination of sentence length, disciplinary history, gang validation status, and perceived threat level. This process has been controversial. Civil rights lawsuits have argued that classification errors or rigid policies sometimes placed incompatible individuals in proximity, increasing the risk of violence. State officials have countered that the system is necessary to manage an extraordinarily volatile population. Both claims appear repeatedly in public filings. One of Corcoran's most infamous features is its use of highly controlled exercise yards. Unlike open prison yards where dozens or hundreds of inmates move freely, Corcoran pioneered a system of small, enclosed yards, often referred to in reports as walk-alone yards or controlled movement yards. These spaces are surrounded by high concrete walls and observation towers. Inmates are released in carefully selected pairs or small groups, sometimes individually, based on compatibility assessments. According to multiple investigative reports from the 1990s and early 2000s, these yards became the center of intense scrutiny after a series of shootings by correctional officers. Official accounts stated that lethal force was used to stop inmate-on-inmate assaults. Critics, including civil rights attorneys and investigative journalists, alleged that some incidents involved inadequate supervision, poor pairing decisions, or delayed intervention. Several cases resulted in lawsuits, settlements, and internal reforms. The facts of each incident vary, but the outcome was the same. Corcoran became synonymous with controlled violence, a place where every movement carried risk. Inside the housing units, daily life follows a rigid rhythm. Count. Meals. Yard. Count again. According to former inmates and staff interviews published in news outlets, the predictability is both stabilizing and suffocating. You learn quickly that routine is survival. Deviating from it, even accidentally, draws attention, and attention in a place like Corcoran can be dangerous. Gang presence at Corcoran is not a rumor. It is documented. Court filings and oversight reports have repeatedly acknowledged the influence of prison gangs within California's maximum security facilities. At Corcoran, validated members of groups such as the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Black Guerrilla Family, and Nuestra Familia have been housed over the years, alongside associates and rivals. Prison officials maintain detailed separation policies, but enforcement is imperfect. Information moves faster among inmates than among administrators. Former prisoners interviewed by investigative journalists describe an environment governed by unspoken rules layered on top of official regulations. Where you stand, where you sit, who you speak to. These decisions are rarely spontaneous. They're shaped by race, affiliation, reputation, and history. According to sociological studies of prison systems cited in academic journals, such informal governance structures emerge most strongly in facilities where trust in institutional protection is low. Corcoran fits that profile. Correctional officers at Corcoran operate under constant pressure. According to union statements and testimony in legislative hearings, staff shortages and mandatory overtime have been persistent issues. Officers are expected to monitor inmates who may be hostile, manipulative, or desperate, often with limited backup. The margin for error is thin. One misread situation can escalate rapidly. This tension affects everyone inside the walls. Officers learn to scan hands before faces. Inmates learn to read posture, footsteps, tone. According to former staff interviews, the job demands a level of vigilance that rarely shuts off, even after a shift ends. Burnout is common. So is resignation. Medical and mental health care at Corcoran has been the subject of extensive litigation. As part of the landmark federal cases addressing California prison overcrowding and healthcare deficiencies, Corcoran was cited in filings that described delayed treatment, understaffing, and inadequate facilities. State officials implemented reforms under court supervision, but reports suggest that progress has been uneven. For inmates with serious mental illness, the environment can intensify symptoms rather than stabilize them. Isolation is not always solitary confinement in the traditional sense. At Corcoran, isolation often comes from hypercontrol, limited yard time, restricted movement, minimal human contact beyond orders and counts. According to psychological research referenced in court testimony, prolonged exposure to such conditions can lead to anxiety, depression, and emotional numbing. Inmates describe losing track of time, of seasons, of themselves. Violence, when it occurs, is sudden. Unlike chaotic prisons where fights erupt constantly, Corcoran's violence tends to be brief, targeted, and consequential. According to incident reports analyzed by watchdog groups, assaults often happen during transitions, yard release, cell movement, or meal lines, moments when systems overlap and vulnerabilities appear. When something goes wrong, the response is immediate and overwhelming. Sirens, lockdowns, searches, silence afterward. Lockdowns are a defining feature of life at Corcoran. According to CDCR data and media reports, extended lockdowns have followed major incidents, sometimes lasting weeks or months. During these periods, inmates remain confined to their cells for most of the day. Programs are suspended. Visits are canceled. Tension builds behind closed doors. What makes Corcoran uniquely feared is not constant chaos, but constant anticipation. According to former inmates, you are always aware that something could happen, even if nothing does. The institution trains you to expect impact. Every day feels provisional, subject to sudden change. The air inside Corcoran feels heavier by the third chapter, as if the prison itself has begun to press back against the people trapped inside it. By now, the routines are familiar, but familiarity does not bring comfort. According to court filings and investigative reporting, this is the stage where Corcoran's reputation stops being abstract and starts becoming personal. Corcoran State Prison was built to control some of California's most dangerous and disruptive inmates. On paper, its mission was security above all else. In practice, according to public records and federal investigations, the prison became a place where rigid control collided with chronic understaffing, overcrowding, and a culture shaped by constant tension. By this point in the story, the violence is no longer sudden. It is expected. Inside the housing units, days blur together. The soundscape never changes. The buzz of fluorescent lights, the echo of boots on concrete, the metallic clatter of cell doors opening and closing. Former inmates interviewed by journalists have described Corcoran as a place where time feels stalled, where each hour stretches longer than the last. There is no sense of progress, only repetition. Wake up, count, meals, yard, count again, lockdown, silence. But beneath that routine, something else is always moving. According to court testimony and internal reports, Corcoran has long struggled with gang dynamics that shape daily life in ways staff cannot always control. Groups form not just around identity, but around survival. Alliances shift. Tensions rise and fall. A look held too long, a word spoken too loudly. A step taken in the wrong direction can trigger consequences that no rulebook explains. This is where the environment becomes most dangerous. Not during riots or headline-grabbing incidents, but in the quiet hours when nothing appears to be happening. According to correctional experts cited in oversight hearings, prisons like Corcoran operate under constant low-level pressure. When pressure builds without release, it looks for weak points. One of those weak points, according to multiple lawsuits and investigative reports, has been the yard. Corcoran's exercise yards were designed to separate rival groups. But over the years, classification errors, overcrowding, and operational shortcuts created conditions where incompatible inmates were brought together. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, court records documented a series of fatal incidents on these yards. In several cases, according to judicial findings, officers were present, watching from towers as violence unfolded below. The legal aftermath of those incidents would expose a disturbing pattern. Federal judges later ruled that some shootings by correctional officers were unjustified, concluding that inmates had been placed in situations where violence was predictable, then met with lethal force rather than prevention. These rulings would become a turning point in Corcoran's history, pulling the prison into the national spotlight and forcing the state to confront what was happening behind the walls. But long before those rulings, the inmates already knew. According to interviews conducted by journalists and attorneys, word traveled fast inside the prison. People learned which yards were dangerous, which officers were unpredictable, which days felt tense before anything actually happened. Fear became a kind of currency. You learned to read it in body language, in silence, in the way men stood slightly farther apart than usual. Medical and mental health care became another fault line. According to state audits and federal court filings, Corcoran struggled for years to meet basic standards of care. Staffing shortages meant delayed responses. Overcrowding meant limited access. For inmates experiencing mental health crises, the consequences could be severe. Advocates documented cases where symptoms were ignored or misunderstood until situations escalated into emergencies. This chapter is also where the psychological toll becomes impossible to ignore. Experts who later testified in reform cases described Corcoran as a textbook example of how prolonged exposure to high-security confinement reshapes behavior. Hypervigilance becomes normal. Sleep becomes fragmented. Trust erodes. Even those who entered the prison determined to keep to themselves found it increasingly difficult to stay invisible. Correctional officers were not immune. According to union statements and investigative reporting, staff at Corcoran worked under extreme stress. Mandatory overtime was common. Fatigue was routine. Officers were expected to maintain order in an environment where they were often outnumbered and under-resourced. Some adapted. Others burned out. A few, according to disciplinary records, crossed lines that would later be examined in court. The tension between control and chaos defined daily life. Lockdowns became frequent, sometimes lasting days. Official explanations cited searches, investigations, or security concerns. Unofficially, inmates understood that lockdowns were often used to regain control after something went wrong. Meals were delayed, showers canceled, movement restricted. The prison shrank inward, tightening like a fist. By this stage of the story, Corcoran is no longer just a place. It is a system with momentum. According to oversight reports, once patterns of violence and mistrust take hold, they become self-reinforcing. Every incident justifies more restrictions. Every restriction increases frustration. Every frustration raises the risk of another incident. Families on the outside felt the effects as well. News reports documented loved ones who went weeks without contact during extended lockdowns. Attorneys described difficulty accessing clients. Advocacy groups warned that isolation was being used as a management tool rather than a last resort. The prison, designed to contain danger, was increasingly seen as generating it. The kind that settles after years of pressure finally force a reckoning. By the time Corcoran State Prison entered the national conversation in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was no longer just another maximum security facility in California's vast correctional system. According to court filings, investigative journalism, and federal oversight records, it had become a symbol of what happens when policy, overcrowding, and institutional culture collide without accountability. Public scrutiny did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through paperwork, internal incident reports, autopsy records, civil rights complaints, lawsuits filed quietly by families who said their loved ones never should have died. According to federal court documents, several fatal incidents inside Corcoran were not spontaneous acts of chaos, but predictable outcomes of housing decisions, supervision failures, and response delays. Each case on its own might have been dismissed as tragic but isolated. Together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. One of the most consequential moments came when federal courts began examining California's prison system as a whole. According to court rulings later upheld by the Supreme Court, overcrowding across the state had reached unconstitutional levels. Corcoran, designed to hold far fewer men than it eventually housed, became a focal point in these findings. Cells intended for one person held two. Yards designed for controlled movement became pressure zones. Medical units stretched beyond capacity. These are not secrets. They were documented in state audits and federal monitor reports. Inside the prison, the consequences were immediate and personal. Officers described exhaustion and burnout in sworn testimony. According to union statements and legislative hearings, staffing shortages meant fewer eyes on the yard, slower responses to emergencies, and greater reliance on lockdowns to maintain control. Inmates, according to court declarations, described an environment where unpredictability governed daily life. Not knowing whether a routine movement would turn dangerous became part of survival. As lawsuits progressed, some of Corcoran's most controversial practices were forced into the open. Housing policies were scrutinized. Use of force reports were re-examined. Surveillance footage, once buried in archives, was replayed in courtrooms. According to judicial findings, reforms were not optional. They were ordered. Training protocols were updated. Yard procedures were altered. Oversight mechanisms expanded. These changes did not erase the past, but they marked a shift from denial to acknowledgement. Yet the fallout extended beyond policy. Corcoran's reputation had already escaped its walls. In public perception, it became shorthand for danger, for a system pushed too far. News reports routinely referenced it when discussing prison violence nationwide. Advocacy groups cited it as evidence of systemic failure. For families of those incarcerated, the name alone carried weight. Fear, anger, a sense that once someone entered, outcomes were uncertain. Inside the prison, the legacy of those years lingered in ways that statistics could not fully capture. According to interviews with formerly incarcerated individuals conducted by journalists and researchers, the psychological imprint of Corcoran stayed long after transfer or release. Hypervigilance became normal. Trust was rare. Routine sounds, a gate slamming, an alarm chirping, triggered instinctive reactions. These accounts align with academic studies on long-term incarceration in high-security environments, which note lasting effects on mental health even after conditions improve. For correctional staff, the legacy was equally complex. Many officers entered the profession believing in order, structure, and public safety. According to testimony before state committees, some left disillusioned, citing a system that asked too much and supported too little. Others stayed, adapting to reforms while carrying memories of incidents that could not be undone. The institution changed, but the people inside carried history with them. Over time, Corcoran did evolve. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation records, population levels decreased following statewide reforms. Classification systems were refined. Oversight became more robust. These changes reduced some risks, but they did not erase the prison's past. History does not vanish simply because procedures improve. It remains embedded in architecture, culture, and memory. What ultimately defines Corcoran's legacy is not just the violence that occurred there, but what that violence revealed. It exposed how quickly systems can fail when warning signs are ignored, how overcrowding transforms tension into inevitability, how bureaucracy can dull urgency until tragedy forces attention. These lessons extend beyond one prison, one state, one era. They echo wherever institutions prioritize containment over humanity without safeguards. In the broader context of American corrections, Corcoran stands as a case study. According to policy analysts and criminologists, it illustrates the dangers of reactive governance. Reforms arrived not because foresight prevailed, but because consequences demanded action. Lives lost became data points in legal arguments. Pain became evidence. Change followed, but at a cost already paid. For those still inside, the story remains unfinished. Every day, according to official schedules, the routine continues. Counts, meals, movement. The machinery of incarceration does not pause for reflection. Yet beneath that routine lies awareness of what happened, of what could happen again if vigilance fades. The legacy of Corcoran is carried forward not just in court opinions or policy manuals, but in that awareness. This is not about closure, because institutions like this do not truly close their stories. It is about reckoning, about understanding how a place earned its reputation and what it took to confront it. Corcoran State Prison is no longer invisible. Its history has been documented, debated, and dissected in public record. That alone marks a transformation. The true measure of legacy is whether those lessons endure, whether future decisions heed documented warnings instead of repeating them, whether accountability remains active rather than reactive. Corcoran's past cannot be undone, but it can serve as a boundary marker, a line that says this is how far a system can fall when oversight fails. And so the story ends where it began, behind concrete walls and locked gates, but with a crucial difference. The silence that now settles is not ignorance. It is awareness, a reminder written into reports, rulings, and memory. A reminder that fear does not arise from chaos alone, but from systems allowed to operate without correction. Corcoran's legacy is not just a warning. It is a record, and records, once exposed, do not disappear.